Wow. Hey, much love and respect. Thanks for taking the time to watch another video. Today we're going to continue talking about a part of slavery that gets least talked about. And that's when it comes to American Indians enslaving each other and helping the Europeans enslave other American Indians. So we're going to continue this great book right here with a lot of good information and sources. The book is called Linking the Histories of Slavery, North America and its Borderlands. That's your School for Advanced Research Advanced Seminar Series, edited by Bonnie Martin and James F. Brooks, and a lot of contributors. So I like to say this is not just what's writing this. A lot of people didn't like my other videos I did recently when it comes to American Indians enslaving each other. They just don't want to believe it. And they said I was just reading Jesuit books, which is not true. I referenced one Jesuit book, and the Jesuit was talking about what he was seeing. You can verify what he's saying and other sources that had nothing to do with Jesuits. We don't focus on Jesuit writings here if that's what you guys think. So dodge your own hijacks. We go through many sources. And it's again, facts over feelings. America is the true old world. Of course, the nations here were doing this to each other. Maybe not the same way in many cases, but they were. So we're going to continue where we left off. In this book last time, we're going to go right into chapter 2. We read chapter 1 already. And chapter 2 is very interesting. It says here from Westo to Comanche, the role of commercial Indian slaving in the development of colonial North America by Eric E. Bound. In the last decade, scholars have begun to recognize the central importance of the native slave trade in the development of colonial North America. Much of that scholarship has focused on the eastern woodlands, but some important recent studies have been undertaken regarding the trans Mississippi West and Southwest borderlands. Understanding the importance of the Indian slave trade is complicated by the fact that legal and moral issues surrounding the activity were interpreted in complex and changing ways throughout the colonial period and across the regions mentioned above. Much of such commerce was legal, and records, though sparse, remain. Indian slavery was often illegal, however, and was, therefore, a clandestine activity that left little direct evidence. Despite this limitation, it has become clear that virtually every native group in colonial North America fell victim to Indian slavers at one time or another. Right? So, who's the slaves? Every Indian nation is being enslaved. Okay, they're being taken captive. They all experience that. Even those groups that went on to pursue commercial slaving themselves. Yet today, there have been few attempts to contextualize and analyze Indian slavery on a continental scale. Even though European demand cross-cut regions and colonizing strategies, native slaves were desired in both plantation and non-plantation colonies, all right? In the plantations, who's the slaves? And they were traded within North America in addition to being exported. Again, exported where? Yeah, many other parts of America, but also Africa and Europe. Native polities throughout North America reacted to this demand in remarkably similar ways, despite having come from diverse cultural and political backgrounds and having practiced disparate forms of aboriginal slavery. A number of examples of which are discussed by Catherine Cameron, chapter 1 in this volume. One of those reactions was to pursue slaving as a primary mode of production by developing an economic and military relationship with one or more European colonies, in which indigenous peoples hunted and captured other native peoples who were then exchanged for European manufactured goods, particularly arms and ammunition. All right, you guys hear that? And this is historical truth. No matter how you feel about it, yeah, many indigenous nations sided with certain European groups against their local indigenous enemies. Under certain circumstances, these types of relationships, though often short lived, had tremendous impact on the shape of colonial history. The intrusion of European commerce into the New World had the ability to transform native polities at great distances from Euro American beachheads. And the driving force behind such transformations was the influence of this new commercial slave and livelihood. My own research has shown that in the South, this economic strategy developed as a result of a set of circumstances that allowed the Westo Indians to seize almost complete control of the market for several decades during the 17th century, enslaving many indigenous people and trading with Europeans. All right, so real quick, in case you guys don't know, a lot of people don't know about the West. So they're actually, as it says here, an Iroquoian Native American tribe encountered in the southeastern US by Europeans in the 17th century. They probably spoke an Iroquoian language. The Spanish called them people Chichimeco. They called them Chichimeco, not to be confused with the Chichimeca, huh? Sound very similar. And that group's in Mexico. And Virginia colonists may have called the same people Recalhecrian. The first appearance in the historical record is as powerful tribe in colonial Virginia, a powerful tribe. Remember, they were seasoned the slave trade for many decades. They were heavy traders of Indian captives. As it says here, Virginia established a trading relationship with the Westo, exchanging firearms for Indian slaves. When the Westo migrated to the Savannah River, they quickly became known for their military power and their slave raids on other tribes. Okay, this is real. Right, so that was just a little bit of history. Let's go back to the book. So again, the Westo, they seized almost complete control of the market for several decades in the 17th century. These circumstances included their own experiences in the beaver wars of the Northeast, Euro-American inexperience with native languages, and with the geography of the interior Southeast, privileged access to European arms and ammunition, an easily exploitable resource. Mission Indians in Florida, and so-called pagan Indians along the Spanish frontier, and access to European markets. As I have argued elsewhere, Westo depredations were one of the major factors that led to the formation of a number of native confederacies. Listen, because this was so big, because it was going on so much, so many indigenous people getting taken captive by these groups, that it forced a lot of Indian nations to come together and create confederacies. So this was changing the way of life. This was big, including those of the Yamasee and Creek peoples. Of course, the targets of Westo's slave trade sought the protection afforded by European firearms and were thus forced to participate in the virgin slave trade themselves. As the trade expanded, the Westos could no longer satisfy the European demand for captives, though they attempted to maintain their permanent position. So they couldn't even keep up. So imagine, guys, how many people are they giving to the Europeans and the Europeans turning into slaves? And these are Indians. We're not talking about African slaves. I want you guys to pay attention to this. One of the major sources of American slaves was the local American Indians. Apart from the indentured servants and undesirables from Europe, this was one of your main sources, not Africans. And they wanted more and more, and they couldn't keep up with the demand. From the perspective of their English trading partners, the once indispensable Westos had become an obstacle to economic growth. In response, a group of Carolina planters financed a secret war against the group, which was effectively destroyed within 2 years. Without the Westos' interference, Carolina merchants were able to further expand the market in slaves, entangling every native polity in the region as a consequence. Over the next century and a half, as a result of the deadly combination of old world diseases and the slave trade, the social and political diversity of the region plummeted. The only large Confederate groups, such as the Creeks, remained. Was the story of the Westos unique or simply a local manifestation of a phenomenon that repeated itself everywhere? European commerce intruded into Native America. From the Great Lakes to the Gulf of Mexico, and from the Atlantic coast to the Rocky Mountains and Southwest borderlands. Continuing, it says European colonizing strategies and other important dynamics. Spain was the first European power to establish permanent colonies in North America, founding La Florida in the southeast during the 16th century, and New Mexico and Texas in the southwest during the 17th. They followed an age-old prescription for empire building, attempted to conquer new lands with armies and turn the inhabitants into Christian peasants through the mission system. Previously in Mexico, the Spaniards had exploited the existing native hierarchical political system in order to control their new imperial subjects, the Aztecs, and they hoped to use the same blueprint for their North American colonies. Although they soon discovered that native chiefs in Florida and New Mexico could not exercise the same level of coercive power as the Aztec emperor, Spain was able to create long-lasting relationships with both Mississippian and Puebloan leaders. A recent study discussed further below suggests that despite regularly sending out exploratory parties in the hopes of extending their influence, the Spaniards did not have a tremendous impact on native peoples beyond their colonial settlements and outposts. To be sure, mission Indians contracted Old World diseases throughout the late 16th and early 17th centuries, but it is quite possible that they suffered the brunt of the damage without spreading epidemics to the interior. In the days before the English arrived in La Florida and French influence penetrated the Southwest, interactions between Spanish, Indians, and those of the interior were much less frequent than they would become. Both Mississippians in the South and Pueblos in the Southwest traded with politically and culturally distinct neighbors on a regular but infrequent basis, and European manufactured goods were simply added to the items already exchanged. Some of the new goods were substitutions for aboriginal products, as in the case of glass beads and other items of jewelry. Other items were clear upgrades, for example, metal, hoe blades, axes, and knives. Yet, because the Spaniards did not supply their native allies with firearms or alcohol, none of these goods were truly transformational, with the exception of horses and sheep in the southwest discussed below. And their availability does not seem to have stimulated market growth. This was due in part to the fact that the Spaniards were less concerned with the Indian trade than with other aspects of their colonial endeavors. In contrast, the French, despite attempting to establish a mission system of their own, were quite interested in developing a commercial exchange with their native host in the Northeast. What began as a way to increase profits on fishing expeditions in the 16th century turned into thriving trade in beaver pelts in the first decade of the 17th. The traders of New France had competition from the Dutch at New Netherlands, as well as from the merchants of New England. All right, so remember who are these merchants? A lot of these are Sephardic Jews, crypto Jews, people with a lot of money. They're investing and financing in these companies and these trades. And remember, we broke down who were the true founders of the Dutch West India Company. Also includes a lot of Moorish Sephardic Jews as well. Go back to the videos if you haven't checked them out. It says here by 1630, the Dutch West India Company, the Company of New France, and the Massachusetts Bay Company were all in operation. The proximity of multiple European colonies and the economic rivalries between them led to intense interactions among their native allies. These interactions created a context in which diseases could readily spread within and between native groups. New England Indians, the Hurons, and the Five Nations Iroquois all suffered multiple disease outbreaks by mid century. Meanwhile, the struggle to develop and maintain native trading partners led Europeans to illegally exchange guns and ammunition in an effort to gain or keep Indian alliances. By the mid 1640s, the Mohawks alone were said to possess as many as 400 Dutch firearms. In response, the French began to arm their primary native allies in New France, the Hurons. An arms race also began among New England Indians following the Pequot War of 1636 1637. And 40 years later, the natives were better armed than colonial militias. Coupled with diseases, guns added a frightening new element to the morning war complex. Tremendous loss of life during epidemics prompted survivors to launch raids to capture ever larger numbers of enemies who could be adopted to replace the dead. Those who possessed firearms tended to target groups that had yet to acquire them. The reverberations from this chaotic mix of guns, diseases, and slaving were soon felt throughout all of eastern North America. This is all going on, guys, at the same time. Farther south, the lengthy Atlantic coast between New Netherland and Spanish Florida was claimed entirely by the English, with the exception of a small Swedish settlement along the Delaware River. And again, these are so called English. Remember, this includes a lot of different people of different ethnic backgrounds coming in as so called English. But this did not prevent a similarly competitive economic situation from arising. By 1629, a trade had developed between Virginians and Susquehannas in the Chesapeake Bay. That trade was challenged when both Marylanders and Swedes attempted to enter the market in the 1630s, as had occurred in the Northeast. In less than a decade, biting war for the allegiance of native groups led Europeans to begin exchanging guns with Indians. Until mid century, the Chesapeake was the southernmost European market for firearms. But in the 1650s, a number of entrepreneurs financed explorations of the Piedmont with the intent of further developing the Indian trade. They successfully expanded the market to the south and west in the 1660s and introduced a new product, as well as Indian slaves. Virginia had recently developed tobacco as an export crop, and the economy could not meet labor demands or afford to import sufficient numbers of Africans and indentured servants to hijack. What Africans? Now remember, they're writing this in modern times, and of course, they're going to add their African slave trade hijack. But of course, they ain't going to have no sources for the Africans, so probably have some for the indentured servants, because we already know that has been debunked. In response, merchants armed their native trading partners with guns and sent them south to capture slaves among groups that did not possess firearms. Again, look how much American Indians are being taken captive and given to Europeans for what? To put in their plantations. And again, what Africans? At the same time, Virginians were developing trade on the southern Piedmont. The French influence was expanding to the west. During the second half of the 17th century, much of the Ohio Valley and the eastern Great Lakes area was abandoned as a result of Iroquois morning wars. You see the Iroquois again. Refugees headed west, where dozens of native groups lived in nucleated villages in present day Wisconsin under conditions that left them extremely vulnerable to epidemic diseases. The Hurons had been so harried by Iroquois slavers and Old World diseases that their population plummeted, and the Ottawas took over as the primary trading partner of the French. In response to Iroquois aggression, in the 1660s, the French built several missions in the western Great Lakes region that served as trading posts and refugee camps, localities that were particularly important to the development of the Middle Ground. The capture of prisoners who could be exchanged during calumet ceremonies was an integral part of native French alliance building and maintenance, but also served to stimulate the growth of the Indian slave trade. Slaves taken from the Paisley as the French referred to the Great Lakes region, including those given to the French during diplomatic exchange, were sent to New France. Some remained there as servants to the colonists, but others were exported to the Caribbean. Okay? That's what I'm trying to tell you. What Africans? They'll call them Africans when they get to the Caribbean, though. But they're American Indians. They're being what? Exported to the Caribbean. And this is what I'm trying to tell you guys. It's other American Indians and undesirable black Europeans that were sent to the colonies, to the plantations, not necessarily Africans. English commercial expansion began in earnest with the founding of Carolina in 1670. Carolina was intimately connected with Barbados, one of England's Caribbean colonies, to which it provided timber, beef, and a large percentage of the natives captured by its primary trading partners, the Westos, okay? This is real history. These American Indians captured by other American Indians, the Westos, who are given to the Europeans, who are not necessarily all so called white, includes many black Europeans, are being sent to the Barbados, and then in history, they're being called Africans or Negroes. And they told you they were coming from Africa. They lied to you about that, and they told us in school growing up, and they put it in the textbooks, and we believed it. But I hope that is very clear to you guys after all my slavery videos what was really going on in colonial times. This is more icing on the cake. The desire for unfree labor in the Caribbean was insatiable. However, and by 1680, even as England's Atlantic trade in African slaves expanded, even though they're supposed to be getting all these slaves from Africa, the Westos could no longer meet the continuing demand for Indian slaves to export from Charlestown. All right, does that make sense to you guys? Even though they're supposedly expanding the African slave, they can't even keep up with the demand for Indian slaves. Why? Why would they want more Indian slaves if it was illegal and they're getting all these so called Africans sent over? Why are they so desperate for more indigenous captives? Think about that. They kind of tell them themselves when they make these statements right here. The Westers couldn't even meet the demand for Indian slaves to export. Over the next 2 decades, therefore, the influence of the commercial slavers, who helped to supply the growing Caribbean labor market, spread across the lower South, pulling every native group into a complex web of interactions that offered new opportunities to some, but threatened the very existence of most. By connecting native groups across wide geographic areas and increasing the frequency of contact between them, the market system created a context in which epidemic diseases could easily spread across the region, in part as a result of depopulation. The search for victims took commercial slavers west to the Mississippi and beyond. After more than 2 decades of exploration in the Mississippi River Valley, the French founded Louisiana on the Gulf Coast in 1699 and soon began to explore the western tributaries of the Great River in the hopes of expanding both their commercial interests and their native alliance network while simultaneously thwarting English westward expansion. Unfortunately for the peoples of the Mississippi River Valley, the Trans-Mississippi West diseases followed European manufactured goods and commercial slavers into the region with devastating results. In the more southerly reaches of the continent, France was able to befriend recent victims of English sponsored slave raids, such as the Quapas and the Cadus, who sought military assistance in the form of firearms to protect themselves from slavers. Meanwhile, in the mid continent, soon after the turn of the 18th century, French guns provided an opportunity for the Osages of the Missouri River Valley to develop a commercial slaving livelihood at the expense of native groups without strong connections to European markets. So they were picking on native peoples who had not allied themselves with Europeans, so they didn't have guns or anything like that. So many different groups of tribes doing this to other tribes, not just the Westos, okay? But now they're telling you as we went further in the United States, different groups were doing it as well. With the French, as France's Indian allies probed west in search of hides and slaves, they encountered native groups within Spain's sphere of influence and consequently connected Spanish markets in the southwest with English and French markets in the east, adding horses to the already lethal mix of guns and slaving. Horses were introduced to the southwest and southern Great Plains early in the 17th century. We're going to dodge the hijack big time because I have a video proving we already had horses here when the Europeans arrived, and horses originated in the Americas, scientifically proven, and went into Asia from here, out of America. At first, access to horses drew diverse native groups to the plains and lessened their dependence on European and indigenous markets. But the introduction of guns from the east and an increased demand for Indian slaves changed the dynamics in the west. Native groups who practiced a mixed hunting and farming economy, because they spent a predictable part of the year gathered around their agricultural fields, became potential victims of slavers. Those groups who were able to obtain both arms and horses fought for control of the market system that now connected the pueblos of the Rio Grande Valley and the horse cultures of the southern plains and the villages of the Red River Valley with New France, Louisiana, and the Atlantic colonies. The Yumanos acted as middlemen in a long distance trade before the Spanish arrived in the region. But after the introduction of the horse, they lost their permanent position in the exchange network to Plains Apache groups. In the early decades of the 18th century, however, the Comanches acquired French guns to go with their large horse herds, and they used the combination not only to observe the Apaches, but also to develop perhaps the most influential of all commercial slaving society. So the Comanches grew to be very big when it came to enslaving other nations and Europeans. Within the context of these diverse European colonizing strategies and native foreign policies, a number of interwoven dynamics were at play, four of which were extremely important: the development of the Atlantic market system, the introduction of Old World diseases to North America, the dislocation and consequent migrations of scores of native groups, and their coalescence into the new social and political forms. The introduction of guns and horses was transformational and forced groups in contact with those who had acquired these items to use all available efforts to acquire them as well, a fact that forged the political economy of native North America during the colonial period. Old World diseases have long been recognized as having had a tremendous impact on native populations, and recent studies have shown that the more developed a trading network, the more readily epidemic diseases spread between populations. The effects of the market system and diseases caused the dislocation of many native groups and migrations, sometimes across vast distances, were a regular part of the colonial world. Dislocated groups routinely joined with others to form coalescent societies, polities composed of previously unrelated peoples, sometimes speaking different language, you see? So different people were coming together because of this, who formed new social and political institutions, often in new locations. They're talking about American Indians here, in the hopes of maintaining cultural viability. Coalescence was so common, lands, in fact, that the majority of native societies in the 18th century, especially throughout the eastern woodlands and Great Lakes region, were products of this process. Very important right there, guys. A lot of mixing going on amongst different peoples that had to come together by force they felt, and eventually they became like a tribe or a society. The engine that drove these monumental changes was commercial slaving, all because of slaving, a livelihood made possible by a combination of factors at play within the sub-regions of the continent at various times during the colonial period. Okay? Hope you guys enjoying the reading so far. Again, this is history we need to know, and we must learn from it so we don't repeat the same history. I know you guys heard that before. Continuing, it says here factors that made commercial slavers powerful and influential. A decided military advantage. No matter the region, the commercial slaving strategy could be pursued only under the right set of circumstances. A decided military advantage was absolutely necessary, and the key to such an advantage in the eastern woodlands was privileged access to European firearms, all right, guns. Native groups with such access were almost invariably successful in military campaigns against groups who lacked it, all right, very unfair. Although a bow could fire arrows rapidly and was usable in inclement weather, guns inflicted terrible wounds beyond the abilities of indigenous medical practitioners to treat. The native desire for firearms and ammunition was universal, and in every region of the continent they went to great lengths to obtain them. Native access to firearms was almost invariably the result of multiple European nations vying for control of the Indian trade in the same region, despite laws that commonly forbade the exchange of guns with Indians. As I'm reading this, guys, it just reminds me of modern times, like, how they bring guns into the neighborhoods. There's no gun factories in the inner cities and all that. So who's really bringing in the guns that ends up in the hands of these young men who end up killing each other? It almost sounds like the same story here, just in a different form. Such competition between European powers gave natives access to firearms in the 17th century in New England, New France, New Netherlands, Virginia, Maryland, and Carolina. By the turn of the 18th century, virtually every native group in eastern North America possessed guns, even those that had little or no direct contact with European traders. A fact noted by a number of intrepid explorers. This glut of firearms forced commercial slavers across the Mississippi in search of victims, but in the trans Mississippi West and the Southwest borderlands, the mobility and power of the horse were additional requirements for military success. Once a military advantage was gained, it had to be maintained by either controlling access to the market in order to keep guns out of the hands of others, or by traveling to areas that did not yet have guns in search of victims. The Five Nations Iroquois blocked their western neighbors' access to English and Dutch markets, and were thereby able to systematically enslave, sell, and adopt thousands of Hurons and others in the 1640s and 1650s. The Westos also maintained a near monopoly on guns, coming out of Carolina between 1674 and 1680, during which time they too captured hundreds, perhaps thousands, perhaps thousands of Indian slaves. Not the white man. What white man? This happened too. No ifs, ands, or buts. When it was not possible to keep neighbors from acquiring firearms, slavers had to travel, sometimes hundreds of miles, to find groups vulnerable to capture. Englishman Gabriel Arthur spent several months in 1673, 1674 with the Tomahitans and accompanied them when they journeyed from Virginia to Spanish Florida on a slave raid. Once the Illinois acquired guns in 1686, they began raiding South and West against people who did not yet possess firearms. The Chickasaws, too, crossed the Mississippi River before the turn of the 18th century in search of bow and arrow Indians to enslave. They were searching what? For the bow and arrow Indians, the ones who didn't have guns. Man, how is that fair? And how does that make you a warrior? I just want to be real with everybody listening. Is that a true warrior when you go, you have an advantage, you have a gun, and and you know you're gonna most likely win? Is that being a true warrior? I guess at the time they did it for survival so they wouldn't be enslaved, but I'm just saying. Continuing, a strategic geo-economic location. Occupying an advantage geo-economic location was only slightly less important than maintaining a clear military advantage, and often required a migration of some sort in violence to procure and maintain. Although the Mohawks did not have to move to develop a relationship with the traders in New Netherlands, they did have to displace the Mohicans, whose villages were located between the Mohawks and the Dutch. The Westos traveled from the shores of Lake Erie to the Virginia back country. That's where they were from. And then onto the Savannah River on the border of present day Georgia and South Carolina, ostensibly to procure a stable market for arms and Indian slaves. Again, the Westos Iroquois. Henry Woodward, Carolina's principal Indian trader, over the first decade and a half of the colony's existence, encountered a group of Shawnees on the savannah who had traveled from the Ohio Valley to Spanish Florida and back to Carolina in search of an exchange partner. Similar long distance migrations also occurred west of the Mississippi River, as evidenced by the Comanches, moved from the New Mexico's far northern frontier to the southern plains, where they violently displaced the Plains Apaches, who had previously dominated trade in the region. Not all economically motivated migrations covered such long distances. The lower creeks moved from the Apalachicola River Valley to the Ocmulgee in the 1690s to take advantage of a newly built English trading establishment and to put some distance between themselves and their former Spanish allies. The Yamasee traveled an even shorter distance to establish partnership with the English when they moved from the northern frontier of the Spanish mission system to Port Royal when Scots founded a short-lived colony there in 1685. We're talking about continuing, it says, an easily exploitable resource. In addition to military and geoeconomic advantages, commercial slavers needed access to an easily exploitable resource. That is to say, native groups that did not possess European arms and ammunition, and by implication lacked European friendship and military support. If possible, traditional enemies were targeted, but the new dynamics of the market system often set strangers upon one another with little cost beyond the need to acquire currency to exchange. That's deep right there because before, before the Europeans got here, as we read in the previous videos when we were talking about this, the enslavement of the Indians by themselves, they were actually taken captives for many different reasons, mostly enemies though. They weren't really going and just targeting random people. It was usually somebody they had war with. And again, a lot of those captives would become adopted. They would be able to raise their status through kingship. They married in or were adopted in some way to the tribe. But now it's a whole different thing. Europeans are here, and now they're invading other indigenous groups with little cost beyond the need to acquire currency just for money and survival, but just for money mainly, the root of all evil, right? As the availability of firearms increased in a given region, potential victims were found in the hinterlands or in small, isolated pockets near colonial settlements. Europeans referred to the latter remnant groups by a variety of names, including settlement Indians, Les Petites Nations, praying Indians, and mission Indians, all right, and benefited from their presence in a variety of ways, but could provide them only limited protection from commercial slavers. The Five Nations Iroquois, the most aggressive and successful slavers in the Northeast, again the Iroquois, targeted primarily other Iroquois speaking peoples during the 1640s and 1650s, but extended their raids into the Ohio Valley and the Paiute Haute in the following decades. The mid Atlantic region beyond the Appalachian Mountains was a potential source of slaves for other groups besides the Five Nations, especially after Virginians expanded their markets to the south and west in the third quarter of the 17th century. The Westos, working with Virginians and later with Carolinians, raided extensively along the northern borders of Spanish Florida beginning in 1659, and the region remained a favorite target for commercial slavers into the 18th century. As native groups that did not possess firearms became scarcer in the east, slavers began raiding across the Mississippi River, putting people at risk in the northern plains, the large river valleys of the mid-continent, such as the Missouri, Arkansas, and Red, the Gulf Coast, and the southern plains. Continuing, it says access to markets. Once slaves had been procured, their captors needed access to a market in which to dispose of their goods. Talking about people here, indigenous people, not Africans. Often that market was located within the region, but as the sale of Apache captives to merchants in French Louisiana attest, the slave trade connected vastly divergent areas in real and meaningful ways. Although far from any colonial settlement in the 17th century, The Chickasaws of northeastern Mississippi were nevertheless positioned to access a number of European markets. To the north and east, the Mississippi River provided a route to the French post of the Pays de Haute, and its tributary, the Ohio, led to traders in the mid-Atlantic region. To the south in the lower Mississippi River Valley were potential victims who could be taken to the Caddo traders along the western tributaries of the Mississippi, or east to Indians who had trade connections with Spanish Florida. You see, so if you didn't have a market, if you didn't have a connect, you would bring your and become major trading partners of the French. Similarly, the Osages turned their access to French firearms into a commercial, slaving livelihood, but only after they had been forced west from the Ohio Valley area, like the Gihasuan cousins, the Quapas. In the southeast, in part as a result of falling victim to slave raids, the Lower Creek peoples ended their alliance with the Spanish, who knew them as Apalachicolas, concluded a peace between themselves and the Westos, with Henry Woodward acting as mediator, and moved to the Ocmulgee River to obtain English firearms. The Yamasee Indian polity was composed of the remnants of several native peoples from present day central Georgia, right? Remnants of different peoples from central Georgia. This is what the Yamasee Indian polity was. And the Sea Islands of Georgia and South Carolina. So you see the connection with the Creeks people, right? Muskegon speaking people, so called Creek, that's not their real names, right? Who were forced to coalesce and settle in the Yamasee Indian polity. This polity consisted of tribes that lived in separate areas but shared common language, languages, customs, religion, and traditions. These tribes shared common language, customs, religion, and traditions. slaving in the East to become important political and military players in the European contest for the continent. And that's the reason you don't know anybody else. They didn't survive these commercial slave raids and epidemics. And again, a lot of these nations that survived were a part of that. As a result of new demographic realities among native societies and new political goals of European empire, the Indian slave trade declined east of the Mississippi after the first couple of decades of the 18th century, quelling to a certain degree the unprecedented loss of social and cultural diversity that had resulted in great part of the Indian slave trade. Caused. That's a big one too. It's unfortunate. And continuing, it says here, conclusion. All right, we're almost at the end of the chapter. It says here, Spanish markets in Texas and New Mexico and French markets in the Pays de Haut and Louisiana together created enough demand for native captives to maintain commercial slaving as a viable strategy, not only in the trans-Mississippi West, Southern Plains, and Southwest, but even as far west as Texas and New Mexico.
Right? And I got lots of friends like that. The bus driver had a harrowing experience before he picked us up. They said he was still a little shook by the time he got to the VA hospital to snatch us up and take us to our destination. And he had this water. He gave like 4 of us one of his waters. So this stuff has still got the frozen ice in it, like I used to do last year going bowling and stuff, you know. And I told myself I was gonna go up to bowling and get the list of what they're gonna start, when they're gonna start the fall season. By the time I got done at the hospital riding buses, it was only one bus, but it's one bus on a long ass ride. If you know what I mean. One bus on a long ass ride on my scooter to get myself home here, you know. But I got here 5 minutes late today to start the show, and then we started having problems. Upside down and ins and outs and overs and unders, and I'm glad that we got 11 people to hit that like button, you know, to say that they enjoyed themselves. Okay. So if y'all ain't got nothing to say, man, you know, I could, if you want, I could drop this show into somebody else's show and we could join their show from my show. What do you think? Maybe I'll get 1 subscriber today. What do you think? Let me know. Seems like some parts of this operation are down here in the basement trying their best to run efficiently. I ain't hating them for that either. If this song were to play, man, it would be all over for Karen. Karen would be out swearing that it had nothing to do with the arbitrary, absent-minded, abstractive miscounting of my music on here. Maybe I've been using them too long. What do y'all think? I need to go get some more. Let me go down here. The new stuff. Let's see what it does. So it seems like all you guys are gone now, right? I want to thank everybody for coming in today. It was a pleasure hanging out with you. Come see, come saw. Come see me again tomorrow morning. Look for me tonight with the link for tomorrow's show, okay? I want to thank all of you for coming in tonight.